Hello. Is a slightly different video setup. I'm trying to use this because I'm better audio. Hopefully there's better audio with this thing. I want to talk about a whole bunch of things. So in my SSRW theory video, there was there's someone who asked me about nihilism, and they said. And I told them nihilists were liars, and I would say that a nihilist is either a wolf or a sheep. Well, it could be a ram. They're definitely not shepherds, that's for certain. But yeah, nihilists are liars. Granted, it depends what form of nihilism. There's like a whole bunch of different categories, and you have, like mereological, epistemological nihilism, which I could agree with, because there's actually sense there, but, this existential nihilism is just like, oh, nothing has value, nothing is meaningful, oh my god. There's no, I don't, that's stupid. And many writers, anyone who's ever, talked about nihilism in history has basically talked about why that's stupid. Nietzsche just said this is like the disorder. This is like what happens when you see that your personal moral beliefs aren't represented in the world, and it's the feeling of dismay that results in that. But yeah, this isn't about nihilism in general. But my point is, in order for me to talk about nihilism, I have to really talk about objectivity and subjectivity, because a lot of any disagreements that we seem to be having boil down to these basic first principles. About a year ago, it was a little less than a year ago, I made a series of videos titled "Is there objective blank? Is there objective morality? Is there objective reality? Is there objective quality?" The answer to all three was yes. But I realized I was actually making a mistake in the video. I was confusing myself because I was saying how everything is inherently subjective. What I was saying was technically correct, but I didn't realize how to explain it. See, I was making a mistake, or I wasn't explaining an important nuance, and because of that, what I said might have seemed confusing. And looking back at it, it confuses me still. But now, months have passed and my thinking has evolved, and I feel like I figured it out. And I know pretty much exactly what I mean, at least, when I use those different words. Because at the time I was just sort of, it was a thought experiments. My thoughts were fluttering about. There was nothing concrete in nothing necessarily concrete in what I was saying. There is now. So what I'm going to explain now is how these two words work, as far as I'm concerned. It's a good thing, I think. Thoughts evolve, ideas evolve. If your ideas aren't evolving and they're stagnant, it probably means you're doing something wrong. Is what I'm going to say now at the level that it can be written in a book and make perfect, solid deductive sense? I don't know, but it's definitely closer to where I was before. So let's begin. I tried, this was intro. I'm gonna put, links in the description. Pretty much, there's two types, from what I'm seeing. There's two types of objective and subjective. All right, now bear with me now. Okay, it's not easy. It's not simple. But there's two types of objective and subjective. And there have to be two types for us to get as much out of language as we're trying to get. So yeah, and I'm going to try to explain the two types, the two pairs. There's the first pair of objective and subjective, which is sort of the differences between the two pairs is the first pair has an objective and subjective that are not that are mutually exclusive. In the first pair you have objectivity, which is mutually exclusive from subjectivity. In the second pair, you have an objectivity and subjectivity that are not mutually exclusive. Therein lies the difference. Now, before we go on, I have to point out this, like, please nobody tell me that I don't understand what these words mean. This isn't my first time encountering the words objective and subjective, alright? I'm familiar with the dictionary definition. Thank you very much. It's not, you're not, I didn't just make a mistake when I looked at that. I didn't make this huge blunder. No, this is actually, there's a sense that there is actual meaning behind what I'm saying. Definitions are just different. Anyway, so the first pair, I'm going to start with the first pair. The first pair, I like to think of it as sort of inherent, intrinsic, ontological objectivity and subjectivity. It's let's start like that's the actual term for it, inherent objectivity. It's objectivity that is inherent within the universe. It is objectively true in every way. It is the perfect version of the truth that could possibly ever exist. It's like God. So let's talk about this. I mean, classically, you would think of inherent objectivity as sort of the world that exists outside of Plato's cave. Going back to Plato's allegory of the cave, you have Plato's forms, which run free on the exterior of the cave and have a merry old time. The way to think about it conceptually is that the inherent objectivity represents the perfect truth about all matter. And, yeah, so, for example, I have a pen in my hand. The truth of what it means to be this pen is, and this is sort of where epistemological nihilism kind of gets in, and where I would actually agree with that version of it, is it's like, there's so much information right here that we simply don't have access to. Like, we have this approximate idea of what it means to be a pen, but think about the things I don't know about this thing. I don't know how many particles are contained within it. I don't know the exact wavelength of the light that it's reflecting. I don't know how and what those particles are doing. I don't know their positions and momenta. There's a wealth of information I don't know. And even so, I don't even know how this thing could interact with other things. What are the chemical properties of all this thing? You could find out some of this stuff, but you can't find out all of this stuff. There's always a limit. And if you try to take measurements, you're all obviously going to, the measurements have an error to them. And besides, even if they didn't have an error, you'd still run into the quantum mechanical problem, which is once you take enough of a measurement, you actually change the properties of the thing. So if you take a measurement of one of the particles, you'll change its momentum. So you can't ever really know. That right there is one of the reasons that information, all that information, that is the inherently objective information about what it means to be a pen. It's the perfect truth of what it means to be a pen. Now, of course, what can we say about this perfect truth? Well, I've explained what it is, so I've defined it. We can't really analyze it. We can't really make any sort of conclusive statements about it. We can't. It's inaccessible. I've essentially explained that it's inaccessible. I've explained the information about pens that is inaccessible. Information about pens that is always going to be inaccessible. The most important thing to know about this is that this inaccessible information cannot be used to make. It cannot ever be used to make any kind of deductions or theories or theorems, or you cannot divide it up into its predicates and do something with the predicates. You cannot use it to construct. You cannot use it as a predicate to construct larger statements. You can't. You could take it as an axiom. You can't really use it for anything besides knowing that it's there and knowing that it's sort of unreachable. That's the only sense one of the conflicts I sort of got into with people in my videos about objectivity and subjectivity is people were assuming that people were trying to come up with these scenarios where there's an objective truth that all of humanity doesn't know. And to me, that is the inherently objective truth. You know, it's something that we don't and can't know. And if, you know, well, not necessarily can't know, but it's, in the very least, it's something we don't know. And the fact that we don't know it is enough not to make any sort of construction or logical assertion from it. It's just, it's unknown, so you can't use it to derive any kind of truth. And they kept trying to come up with scenarios where it's like, you know, all of humanity didn't know something, but, you know, we do, the speaker. And it's like, but this is a fantasy. This isn't a real situation. You can't ever, you're talking about a world where everybody doesn't know. Whatever. I don't want to get into that, but you have to understand that anytime we look at reality through the lens of science or mathematics or anything, we're always approximating reality. We're never seeing it the way it truly actually is. Everything you do is an approximation. If you study physics, you'll see this perfectly. There's an error bar to every measurement that's ever been taken in physics because there's always an error. It's always an approximation. It's always, you know, us looking at reality and trying to figure out, you know, an approximate way that it works, but not actually being able to know the actual true way that it works. And the actual true way that it works, you know, there's all sorts of metaphysics fantasies that philosophers have written about that. It's honestly not that interesting. So let's move on to the second, to inherent subjectivity. Now I mentioned this was mutually exclusive. Well, if we go back to Plato's allegory of the cave, in the allegory of the cave you have human beings who are, you know, we are not outside of the cave playing with the forms. We are stuck inside a cave, and there are shadows dancing on the wall behind us, and there are objects dancing like in front of a fire behind us, and there's shadows on the wall in front of us. And what we're looking at is the shadows, which is essentially what I've just explained about inherent objectivity. Is how we're always looking at the we're always looking at the approximation of the form, not the form itself. The approximation of the form is the only thing we have access to, and as a result, everything we see through a sort of lens. You know, it's also, it's not even just the fact that we're approximating everything we see. It's the fact that the very act of sight itself, even if we weren't approximating, just by having a lens, what you see of the world, the way you interpret the forms, it's always going to be, you know, the way the lens was, it's always going to be predicated on how the lens was designed to interpret things. You know, we have a lens, and we use that lens to see objects. We use that lens to use logic and make mathematical deductions. But all of that stuff, even logic, sight, sound, all of our senses, that stuff was engineered into us through evolution. So its actual purpose and what it's actually looking at isn't necessarily known to us. Everything we see and experience could just be specifically designed for a particular purpose, which is not to see the actual truth, which is not to see the inherently objective truth, right? One must be open to this possibility. It all falls into that same like old Socratic idea that's like, the only thing I'm certain of is that I know nothing, and yeah, this is what inherent subjectivity essentially says, is that we don't actually know anything. We, like, in an inherently objective sense, we know things in an inherently subjective sense. We see shadows, we see approximations, we use logic and mathematics in the way in which it was designed for us, for our brains to use. Once we encounter a contradiction, it's, you know, it is false or it is incorrect because we cannot analyze it, because we don't understand something when it's a contradiction, because our brains were engineered in such a way that if I look at a piece of paper and it says 1 = 0, I get confused. It doesn't make any sense to me, so I ignore a statement like that and go on to a statement that I do understand. That is why contradictions are wrong. It's because we can't understand them, not because there's an inherent wrongness in them, right? Stuff like that, you know. These are all the implications of inherent subjectivity. Everything, you know, basically you take all you take all contradictions and sort of things that seem false and you put them into a pile and you just say this is the pile of things we don't understand, things we can't understand, and we're going to stick to things we do understand, which are the shadows dancing on the walls. So when you encounter a contradiction, you're essentially encountering something that is not a shadow, or something that your inherently subjective lens can't figure out, can't perceive. So that's the second pair. Now, before people get upset, it's just like, he's saying everything's subjective. No, I'm not saying anything. I haven't said anything about morality either. For the record, I believe in objective morals and objective value. There's the second definition of objective and subjective, remember. The point here with these two is that anytime somebody tries to define the two words, these are essentially the definitions that we get to. These sort of very generalized epistemological ideas. It has nothing to do with actual truth claims about the world. It has everything to do about how we perceive the world. And that's why there's a difference between the first pair and the second. If anything I said sounds a little insane to you, then I honestly challenge you to try and, explain how neither of these what kind of framework would you get if neither of these concepts existed? Because from what I'm seeing, the way I see it is you need both inherent objectivity and inherent subjectivity to have any kind of sense, because you're going to run into troubling philosophical areas if you assume one of them isn't present. If you assume that there is no inherent objectivity, that there is no truth, then that's just like nihilist BS. That's it doesn't even make sense to say that it doesn't exist. It really doesn't. It means that there's because everything follows from the definition of inherent objectivity. Everything comes from there. Everything's an approximation. You can't have shadows dancing on the wall, if there's no object in front of a fire for which the shadows are to dance, right? So if there's no inherent objectivity, there's no forms, there's just nothing. So what exactly are we seeing and experiencing then, right? So you run into that troubling problem. I don't know if that's consistent at all, but I think just the fact that you have to assume logic makes sense and works implies that there's some sort of inherent objectivity, and that logic is an approximation of inherently objective logic. So you're going to run into a problem there. If you assume inherent subjectivity doesn't exist, then you run into the problem of assuming that we know everything, which is clearly patently false. Like I said, I pointed to my example of a pen, and I explained how we can't know everything about a pen, and just empirically demonstrable, right? It's so self-evident you can't even explain it, and if you're going to say that that's not a case, that we're not looking at shadows, then you really run into a problem of trying to explain how it is we could ever be wrong about anything. If we're never looking at shadows, if we're always looking at objects, how exactly is anyone wrong about any claim that they make, right? So yeah, there's that problem. It's not obvious either. So these two ideas have to exist, but these two ideas, they don't have anything to do with truth. They don't have anything to do with what we consider to be true or what we consider to be false. They are just claims about how we see the world. Let's move on to actual ideas of truth. So there's the second pair of objective and subjective. And in the second pair of objective and subjective, and this might sort of be the dictionary definition, is what people say is like objective is when the properties are of the object, and inherent it's like the property of the subject, or the subject's way of seeing things. I hearken back to this guy Brian, who went on Stefan Molyneux's show and was trying to prove to him that all subjects are objects. And I actually, at the time, I sort of humored him, but I see exactly what he meant now, and he was perfectly correct. Because, see, here's what happens. We're inside this inherently subjective lens, so we have to define a standard for truth within this inherently subjective lens. Then this is what we do. Every standard for truth, empiricism, rationalism, any logic, mathematics, evidence, These are all standards for truth that we have defined within our lens. So we have, standards of logic that are studied in philosophy, and you have all those different kinds of logic, like modal, predicate logic, etc. These are all, these are all people trying to establish good standards of truth and good standards of proof. And it's not easy. It's a lot more complicated than we think. Yeah, I'd say something like logic, and everyone's just like, "Oh, I know about that." It's like, no, you probably don't, unless you've taken like actual, crazy philosophy courses. There's a lot to logic that really isn't obvious. There's a lot to logical thinking that is actually not easy to justify and not easy to study or even understand. There's so many different axiom systems and frameworks and, just symbolic logic. It's a huge field. Go look it up on Google or Wikipedia to just see a big brushdown where they give you a whole list of different topics. And this is stuff that philosophers study, right? This is like analytical philosophy. It's a whole big shtick. So, this is people trying to establish standards for truth, trying to agree on standards for truth. In science, they have a different standard for truth. Well, actually, that's people trying to establish deductive logic as standard for truth. There's also inductive logic, which is the basis for scientific evidence, which is the basis for empirical evidence and basically what we know about the real world. Deductive logic is the basis for the mathematical world. Inductive logic is the basis for the scientific one. And these are all standards for truth that we agree on, etc. So, when we say, what that means is that the second pair of objective and subjective, the idea of objects and subjects, these are things that have to be defined within the realm of inherent subjectivity. These are things that have to be defined from this lens. These are things that simply are defined from within the lens. So truth, standards for truth are defined within the lens. So, a true statement about an object or about the property of an object can be said to be objective. This is the second kind of objectivity. I like to call it use objectivity. It's the kind of the objectivity that people use. So, this pen has an orange cap. It's an objective statement, right? It's an objective statement. It's an objectively true statement because for the standard of truth that I'm using, it's correct. For the standard of truth that you guys are probably using, it's also probably correct. You look at this thing and you say, "Oh, it's orange." The cap is. So yeah, and it's the same thing for every truth claim ever. You can look at any truth claim and say it's objectively correct or it's objectively incorrect. The standard for objective truth is defined, the way it's defined within, logic and mathematics, etc. So yeah, that's what you get. And so obviously then we can easily define objective truths about reality and objective truths about morality and objective truths about like anything. Objective truths about morality, they follow in the same sense because, for example, if you have a snake and say, "Oh, the snake prefers warm temperatures because it is cold-blooded," that is an objective statement. That is an objectively accurate statement about the functioning of a snake. If a human being says, "I don't like murder," everyone suddenly jumps on the bandwagon and it's like, "Oh, that's a subjective statement. I don't have to take that seriously," in a philosophy class. But really, all you're saying is that this is an entity, an organism, an object that doesn't enjoy the act of murder. That's all you're saying. That's what, like, the way this whole thing works is that every moral statement is just a statement that reflects the properties of the speaker. The objective properties of the speaker. That's how this form of objectivity works. So if I say I don't like murder or I don't like this type of moral behavior, that reflects my properties. You also, but of course you can, like I explained, we have to define a standard of, you know, objective truth. We could define a standard of moral truth as well. We could do the exact same thing that they did in logic and science, and we can establish moral truths and work from there. And then we can establish some people as morally wrong, objectively morally wrong, and some people as objectively morally right. And it's perfectly consistent. You know, and if someone says, I like murder, and I say, and the agreed upon objective moral standard is that murder is wrong, then I'd say, well, this person is clearly incorrect. How do we agree upon an objective moral standard? Well, we have a conversation. We come together and we talk about it and we decide and we reach a consensus. You know, if enough people agree on what moral truths are, then that's how we treat moral truth. It's no different than what happens in science. Enough people come together, they see evidence, and, you know, they see the same thing and they agree that that's what the truth is. Enough people see this orange cap and say this is an orange cap. You know, it's the same exact process with morality. The difference is in morality, the reason people don't as often agree in morality is because it's very easy to lose yourself in personal biases and to not actually realize what's good for you. So, and like I would argue that it is actually possible for everyone to agree, because what's in everyone's interest is actually the same thing. Every bad, vulgar system of morality is people just not realizing what's in their best interest. That's what Aristotle said. You know, he said evil is just not knowing what's good for you, and that's essentially, like, I agree with that. Sociopaths just don't realize that what they're doing isn't good for them. No matter how much they believe in it, no matter how much they think that it's good for them, no matter how much, you know, religious nutbags think that something's good for them, and they're all deluded because what they're doing isn't actually good for them. So yeah, we could easily establish objective moral truths, and, you know, it's just they're established by consensus, just like other objective moral truths are established. This is why I had so much shit in those other videos, because I said objectivity is determined by consensus, and this is why the issue. Inherent objectivity is not determined by consensus. Inherent objectivity is inherent objectivity. But use objectivity, the objectivity that's used to make truth claims about X, Y, and Z, that is determined by consensus. Entirely determined by consensus. So then we work off of that. So then every statement that is ever made by a person is an objective statement. It's a statement that is made by an object, you know, because people are objects, and it's a statement that is made about objects. There are obviously statements that are objectively incorrect, and there are statements that are objectively correct, but the point is every statement falls under this umbrella of being an objective statement. So then there's there's subjectivity. And this is where I think the idea here shines, because this is the second form of subjectivity. It is not exclusive from the second form of objectivity. As I mentioned at the start, the difference between the two pairs is that the first pair, subjectivity and objectivity, are different. You cannot. An inherently objective statement is never an inherently subjective statement. But here, this isn't the same thing. Here, the two statements are not mutually exclusive. A use-objective statement can also be a use-subjective statement. And a use-subjective statement is always a use-objective statement. And this is what Brian figured out. And he just said, simply, all, you know, subjective things are just a subset of objective things. You know, he just used set theory and then said that that's just how it works. Subjective is a subset of objective because subjects are subsets of... the set of subjects is a subset of the set of objects. And yeah, that's essentially how it works. Every subjective statement is definitely an objective statement. But not every objective statement is a subjective statement. And the reason there's a difference is because we have to establish, you know, a standard for truth and a standard and how exactly the truth value of a subjective statement is treated. So, you know, defining the word is essentially what I'm saying. And I'm saying that subjective statement is a statement that has equal value to, you know, A subjective statement is a type of objective statement that is equal value to a different kind of objective statement. To an objective statement that is different. So, for example, if I say, I like the color red, that's an objective statement by definition of objective that I used earlier. And someone else says they like the color blue, then what you're saying, then those are both examples of subjective statements, because the value of me liking red is no different than the value of you liking blue. Or this is a little different because this would be the moral value of me liking red, or versus the moral value of you liking blue. Whereas we're concerned with truth value, but you could use that as well. For example, you could say, in your truth standard, you could say that, maybe I'm colorblind, and I see this orange cap as green, or color distorted, whatever, and I say it's not orange, it's green. Right? It's not orange, it's green. And in my standard for truth, this is a green cap, not an orange cap. So then, to say that the differences are subjective is to say that the truth value, right, the truth, the correctness of saying that this pen cap is orange is equal to saying that the pen cap is green, right? If I could call your attention to this thing that happened in the internet a while back, there was like a picture of a dress going around, and everyone was saying how the dress was white and gold, and other people were saying that it was black and blue. Well, this is where you can introduce subjectivity and say, well, it's subjective, right? So what that means is it's subjective, is saying that it's white and gold is equally true as saying that it's black and blue. Or saying that this pen is orange is equally true to saying that it's green. That is what a subjective statement, that's how the subjective statement works. That's how this brand of subjectivity works. Now, if you're going to look at me and say, well, that's obviously not true, I never said that it is. I'm just saying that this is how subjectivity works, right? The way it works depends on your truth standard, right? And if in our truth standard we all agree that saying this pen cap is orange is equally true to saying that the pen cap is green, then that is what is objectively true. So sorry, then both truth values have equal value. If we, in other words, if we just agree that different truth conflicting statements have the same truth value, then we can, then we've agreed on subjectivity. Then we agree on when something is subjective. If I were to say that no, this pen is not green, it's orange, and that is not subjective. If I were to say that it is not subjective, then what I'm saying is that the truth value of this pen cap being orange is higher than the truth value of this pen being green. Is objectively higher than the pen being green. If they're the same, then what I'm saying is the objective value is the same in both cases. In other words, this might have sounded confusing. Subjectivity is just saying that two different things have the same objective value. That's all it is. That is the use definition of subjectivity. Now, if you're going to tell me that this is how I use subjective, then you haven't really, either I've not explained myself well or you haven't been paying attention. But this is not simply how I use the word subjective. This is how everybody uses it. If you go around and talk to like the subjectivists, talk to the people who believe in subjective value, say to them, oh, Lord of the Rings is the best set of movies ever made, and they're going to say, well, that's subjective. What they're actually saying is that Lord of the Rings my interpretation of Lord of the Rings has the same objective value as a different interpretation of Lord of the Rings, a different conflicting interpretation. That is what they are actually saying by that phrase. That is logically what their statement is saying, that I can't consider my interpretation of that movie to be superior to anybody else's, that their value is identical, their truth value is identical, or their moral value is identical. That is what is ever meant by the word subjective. In other words, it's exactly what I said. It's just saying that objective value is the same in both cases. Now, what this means for ethics and morality, it's really complicated, and I honestly I don't have time to go into it in huge detail, but, you know, a lot of what this feels like is it's like inherent. A lot of what this sort of makes it seem to be is that you're always going to have, in any ethical framework, you're always going to have some amount of subjective statements and some amount of objective statements. So within your truth standard, within your standard for what is true and what is correct and what is morally good, you're going to have some things that are morally better than others. You're going to have some things that are more true than others. You're going to have some things that are more correct than others, but you're also going to have some different things that are equally true and some different things that are equally morally valuable. Right? And this, again, just follows, and this follows from just the fact that you can't eliminate this idea of subjectivity. You always have to have some of it. And how this applies to any framework of ethics is it goes beyond the scope of this video, but I'm just trying to sort of explain how whenever people use this word, they aren't talking about something that is non-objective, because that's what everyone thinks, that's what everyone interprets. Is whenever you use subjective, you are not talking about something objective. You are never talking about something objective. And the big truth is that that is simply not true. That is not the case. You know, whenever you talk about subjective things, you are still talking about objective things. Everything is always objective. You can't ever get rid of objectivity. You can't ever let it fly out the window, because if you do, nothing you say has any meaning. In which case, I don't have to listen to a goddamn word. And this is where the whole thing with the nihilists shows up, and it's like, not, you know, I told nihilists that, I told this guy who asked me about nihilists, I told him, look, nihilists are just, what they're saying is that nothing has meaning. That statement, saying that there is no meaning, that statement itself has no meaning. So, you know, that statement in the very least has no meaning, so then their whole philosophy crumbles. Of course, they don't pay attention to that, but that's, you know, that's how it works. You are never, ever making a non-objective statement. It is not possible. Everything is always use subjective. This second definition of objective. But not everything is always use subjective. There are non-subjective statements. Like I said, you know, it's, for example, I could, like I'm pretty confident that this pen is orange. This pen cap is orange. And this is not, and this is non-subjective. So if someone were to come up to me and tell me this pen cap is not orange, I would say you're wrong. This pen cap is orange. I don't know what you're seeing, but this pen cap is orange. In my truth standard, this pen cap has to be orange. So what I'm making is a non-subjective statement when I call the pen cap orange. You know, it is not my statement is not of equal truth value to a conflicting or opposing statement. Everything has a truth value, right? Everything has a truth value. Subjectivists pretend that truth value somehow goes away when you call something subjective. It doesn't. Subjective just means truth values are equal. You know, that's all it means. So you can't make truth value go completely away, because what you're saying has meaning. You know, if there's no truth value, then there's no meaning. Then I don't have to listen to a word you say. I don't have to agree to a word you say, and I can do with it whatever I want with you. I could kill you, and there's nothing morally wrong with that. I could act like you don't exist, you know, or I could act like you exist and you're wrong, which is what I'll probably do. You know, you're never. The point here is you're never, ever making a non-objective statement. Everything is always forever objective, because the truth standards we use to analyze the universe, you know, they require that everything be objective. You know, it's like people who believe subjectivity is different, what they're believing in really is that there's like a special kind of object within the universe, and this object is called a subject, and this special kind of object is immune to the same criticism and rhetoric and properties that other objects do. It's the whole ridiculous fallacy that human beings are somehow separate entities from just the raw matter that they're comprised of. And I don't have to explain why that's ridiculous. But yeah, and most philosophers, most philosophers alive today, all sort of, they see this. Like Daniel Dennett was saying how, the difference between, we're so confident and wrapped up in our own consciousness that we define, what's that word? We divide up the whole universe into subjectivity and objectivity. We partition the universe into these two categories when this partition should never have existed in the first place, because there are no two categories. There's only one category of objectivity, and subjectivity is a special case of objectivity, and that's just it. So, to wrap up, I've introduced like 5 important concepts here, right? Number 1 is inherent objectivity, which is the objectivity ever present in the universe, the perfect end-all, be-all truth of everything. Inherent subjectivity, which is what we see through our lens, for the shadows of inherent objective truths dancing on a wall. 3, use subjectivity, what we call objective truths in the world using our truth standard. Use subjectivity, which is when in our truth standard 2 different statements have the same objective value. In our truth standard 2 different statements have the same truth value. And non-subjective, non-use subjective, which is the other part of the partition, where a statement that is an objective statement that is non-subjective. So, you have use subjectivity, which refers to everything. You have use subjectivity, which is a special kind of use subjectivity, and you have non-subjectivity, which is the complement of use subjectivity, and refers to all statements that are objectively true and not subjectively true. So, me saying that this pen is orange and defending that claim like this is the truth value of this pen cap being orange is higher than the truth value of any conflicting claim. This is the model by which we actually look at the universe. It doesn't matter. I almost is saying it's like it doesn't matter if you don't even agree on this, because this is what is true. This is how you look at the universe. This is how I look at the universe. This is how everyone does it. There's no debate here. Like, any debate here is either not understanding the definitions, not understanding the words, or not understanding oneself. So, money's probably on the first 2, though. Although maybe on the latter as well in several cases. But returning to the issue of nihilism, like, I call nihilists liars because it's sort of a separate issue, but it ties into this, is because they, what they call subjective is completely meaningless if they're gonna say that they say everything is subjective, and they, like, existential nihilism, you'll say that there's no meaning in anything, but that statement is just meaningless, right? Like, if you accept logic, the first thing that pops into your head is that statement is meaningless, right? Because if that statement is true, then it creates a paradox, and if logic is correct and logic has meaning, then you can't have that. So that statement is obviously meaningless. And the nihilists will actually agree to this. They're going to say, yeah, the statement is meaningless, but so is every other statement. It's like, no, that doesn't follow. If we accept logic, then that statement is meaningless, and that statement alone is meaningless. Everything else still has meaning. In the very least, you'd have to sort of explain it like, that statement is meaningful, but every other statement is meaningless. But even then you run into problems, because that statement on itself cannot... That statement has predicates, which means the predicates need to have meaning. Which means there's a whole bunch of things that have to have meaning, and, so you've essentially partitioned all claims into this There's some things that have meaning, and there's some things that don't have meaning. Well, that's great. That's essentially what I agree on as well, and what every person believes, right? But you haven't explained where the line is. You're just you're just talking fancy. And nihilists going to say, "Oh, you just don't understand." Well, you know, you could be chatting balls. You could be talking absolute nonsense, and you are. You know, if you accept the accepted standard for truth says that you are. So I say it's dishonest, but that's a whole nother issue. Like, it has to do with the fact that if you believe that there's no value in anything, then you're free to do whatever you want, and nobody can call you out on it. If I tell you, how dare you, are you killing people, then you get to say, it's like, well, it's subjective, ha ha ha. You know, you get to get away with whatever you want scot-free and not have to care about what anyone says. It's an awfully convenient position to take if that's the type of thing which you want to do. It's an incredibly selfish position to take. That's what you want to do. I can go into further detail of that, but I don't want to. Nihilists are crazy, and we understand what they're crazy. I'm just going to summarize once more the 5 principles, the 5 ideas. Inherent objectivity, the fundamental end-all be-all truth of everything. Inherent subjectivity, the lens through which we imperfectly see a distorted image of the inherently objective truth. Use objectivity, which is the properties of all objects as they are defined by the truth standard we define within our inherently subjective lens. Use subjectivity, the status of certain objects, or the status of certain objective statements as having equal value to different objective statements, to conflicting objective statements. And use non-subjectivity, which is when two different conflicting objective statements do not have the same truth value, do not have the same value. So, 3 categories. All objective statements that have the same truth value, objective statements that have different truth values. And that's the universe, folks. Yeah, hopefully that made sense. It's not rigorous, but the intuition's definitely there, and the intuition certainly makes sense. So yeah, that's about it. Cheers.